Hi, my name is Spencer, and I'm a video editor living in England. As you might tell from my voice, I'm not originally from there. I grew up in California, and I miss my family very much. So much, in fact, that I regularly stay up pretty late on Friday nights so I can see them through video calls. And to keep myself occupied while waiting for the calls to begin, I decided to start live streaming some acoustic virtual concerts a little while back. Music, however, is something that I am relatively unskilled at, so I decided to put my technological skills to use and at the very least make my live streams a little nicer in one way or another. I've been treating it as practice, so I can get better at two skills at once and make a portfolio piece to prove I'm interesting and should not be bullied for my accent. So here's the mission statement: improve my music live streams and build my portfolio by coming up with an aesthetic and building motion graphics to support it. Let's go. Around 21 years ago, I happened to be born in a hospital in Burlingame to a pair of computer geeks. While I was subsequently abandoned by them and raised in the mountains by wolves, my pack mother always made sure to commemorate this anniversary, and I wanted to do right by her this year. I don't know about anybody else, but it's been kinda stressful for me, and I've been spending a lot of time feeling nostalgic about my life in the mountains before I was adopted by my human family 1 year near Lake Tahoe. So I decided that this week's livestream is going to be based around the significance of someone's 21st birthday. In America, that's alcohol. I knew this week that I wanted to step down the production side of things. I was feeling pretty worn out from all of the work that went to the prior streams and videos, and I also felt that there was a simplicity that they were missing. While the technological advancements of the last few streams were noteworthy, the designs felt cluttered. So I decided to go back to the basic and work with a fairly minimal but realistic aesthetic just like I did for the campfire. The first thing I did was update my livestream advertisement graphic. I went into Clip Studio Paint and opened up the image I made a few weeks ago for my streams. I didn't want to change it very much, so all I did was draw a party hat and one of those blower things and colored them in. I also decided to draw a Santa hat so I wouldn't have to come back and do it again for the next week's theme. While I was in Clip Studio Paint, I also elected to hash out the basic layout for my stream. First, I grabbed an image from my camera to use as a base, then I drew my layout on top of it. I wanted a small counter with a beer on it and perhaps a light vignette all around, as well as a fancy logo in the upper corner for me to write the song titles. The graphic design for most beer companies are based around decadence and elegance, so all I had to do was mirror my canvas and draw a squiggly line and it resulted in a fancy looking banner. I wanted to make another screen as well for whenever I messed up while playing a song. I made the vignette a little more apparent and drew a counter covered in bottles as well as a few notes to keep in mind for post-production. The final thing I designed was a quick blueprint for myself to animate an AFK screen for when I needed to take a break while streaming. Next, I opened up the file I made for my advertisement graphic in Blender. In the previous week, I had made some updates to the guitar's coloration and a system that allowed me to pixelate it, and I hadn't yet exported a version with the updated colors but without the pixelation. I did that really quick and brought it into After Effects to put it together. After an export, I posted it up to social media and called it for the day. The next morning, a new version of Blender, 2.91, launched. I figured I would download it. While I had some experience with experimental branches of Blender crashing frequently, I figured it had to be a stable enough release if the Blender Foundation put it up. I opened up Blender and imported a HDRI. A HDRI is an image file with certain properties that tells the computer how to do lighting and reflection, and since I was making images with glass, I figured that would come in useful. Anyways, it crashed. I opened it up again and I got it to work for a little while longer, and I made a glass full of liquid, some foam at the top, and some coasters with a random image I had lying around. Then I dropped it onto a desk and began positioning the camera. After assigning some materials and dealing with more and more crashes, I made some particle systems to represent the bubbles inside of the glass and the condensation outside of it. At this point, I had been dealing with so many crashes that I was worried for the safety of my render, so I decided to try out something I had been looking into for a little while: AI frame interpolation. I had seen videos of AI interpolated frames before with varying degrees of success. Sometimes people will train it on things like animation, which I think is borderline offensive because it ruins things like timing, momentum, and impact. However, I also understand that gamers are brainwashed into thinking that 60 frames per second is the only way to enjoy visual content, and there's no point wasting skill and effort on people who wouldn't respect it to begin with.
Woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about.
I've always thought of AI interpolation as a potential tool for instances where artistry isn't required, or for an artist to set up a part of a project to allow AI to do the heavy lifting. I told Blender to render out every other frame of the animation, then downloaded FrameFlow. I also re-downloaded Blender 2.90 so that I could actually get some work done today. While waiting for the worryingly long render, I got to work in Clip Studio Paint designing the banner I wanted for the upper corners of the screen. However, I ended up recording the wrong monitor for this process, so I'll just show the results. I designed a seal, as I noticed that many companies had less of a banner and more of a medieval insignia thing going on. I chose to go with a similar color scheme and aesthetic to Stella Artois, a nice flavorless lager I enjoy. When that was done, I designed a quick banner in the similar style to the Sierra Nevada beer because Sierra Nevada is the name of the mountain range I grew up in, and I wanted to pay it homage. My render finished along the way, so I opened up FrameFlow to see what my options were. Unfortunately, the program got confused from my image sequence, and After Effects didn't seem to have any love for it either. To make matters worse, I noticed some problems with the export, so I closed it all down and started again, this time in a proper version of Blender. I don't particularly mind redoing things. I think it's a good way to learn and a great way to get faster. Generally speaking, Blender is the slowest process for me whenever I make these live stream assets because it's the program I have the least experience with. I've been using After Effects for around 4 years now, Premiere for around 9, and photo image editors for nearly 12. By contrast, I've been learning Blender for 3 months, so it usually takes me far more time to accomplish what I want in it. I finished up version 2.0 of the beer scene, complete with some little stains on the wooden table and improved coaster fidelity, and exported it. This time, unsurprisingly, it was a lot faster. Still, there was no time to rest. I had a family video call coming up soon for an American holiday called Thankful Day, so I took the excuse to plug in my camera and began messing with settings in OBS while I was waiting for the render. I wanted to see if I could warp the screen slightly for a kind of drunk effect on one of the overlays. I found something I ended up liking and then got back to my render. I opened up After Effects in the FrameFlow application, but I still couldn't get FrameFlow to work, and due to its generic name, I couldn't find any documentation on it. I gave up and loaded everything into a composition, wherein I noticed a few problems with the bubbles shooting out of the top of the foam. As a workaround, I froze a still image with no particles and masked it on top of the rest of the image, then added a snowfall effect to the beer to make it look fizzier since the bubbles weren't very prominent looking. I added a small vignette and toyed around with the banner. I decided I needed to change it up because something felt a little bit off. I experimented with Adobe Illustrator and I made a note for later. Then I got back to compositing and tweaked some other things. Next, I exported it and opened up DaVinci Resolve to test the colors. I made a noticeable grade for my camera using an old image I found from the previous week and a less noticeable grade for the beer overlay. Then I plugged it into OBS and ran some tests between it and DaVinci to see if I could get a good look going. Eventually, I found something I was relatively satisfied with and then opened up Blender. After setting up a little scene using the materials from the first render, I logged on to my family's Thankful Day call and said my hellos.
Order 3.
Spencer, are you eating pumpkin pie with chopsticks again? Oh, okay. Is it good?
Get bad at this.
Is that because you couldn't find pumpkin?
Okay. And the puff pastry works for you, or do you want me to teach you how to make graham cracker crust next?
The next day, I got started on the fluid simulation. Simulations in general are a huge blind spot of mine. One of the hazards of being entirely self-taught is a lack of infrastructure, and with the system as obtuse as MantaFlow, that usually results in me banging my head against a wall trying to work out why something that works for literally everybody else doesn't work for me. After discovering that nothing I had set up the night before worked, I began trying other solutions and eventually hacked out something using primitive shapes and upscaling the entire thing a fair bit. The only issue was that all of the fluid spilled out the second that one of the cups moved, but I knew this was a problem I could kind of fix in post, thanks to the way I set up the scene. I baked it, resolving to do 2 passes for compositing later. Whilst waiting for the bake, I got started on improving the banner. I began tracing around my outline in Illustrator to convert my raster graphic to a more simplified vector. For those unaware of the difference, a raster graphic is one wherein the smallest possible unit is defined, a pixel. A vector, on the other hand, is infinitely scalable because it is completely defined by mathematical equations relating to curves and graphs. Vectors tend to be used for things like logos because you can make them huge or tiny and you won't end up crushing the details. As such, there's a certain aesthetic sense that vector art tends to carry in our cultural consciousness. I figured that was probably the reason why my banner didn't look quite right to me, something about the line thickness and use of color or something. I decided to only do it to the banner because the seal had more rendered details and variation of line thickness on it and therefore made more aesthetic sense as a raster graphic. Once the banner was done, I went to After Effects. I messed with the colors a little, added some post-processing effects to make it look more cohesive, and exported it. I turned back to the render and found, to my dismay, that it was going slower than molasses dripping off a spoon. I did some calculations and found that it wouldn't be ready by the time I needed to stream, so I took some drastic measures. I set the sampling quality and the resolution down exponentially and rendered both my passes. I brought them both into After Effects and upscaled them using the AI upscaling tool. Then I cleaned up the pass with some rotoscoping and exported it as a H.264 file. Once I had it as a H.264 file, I decided to try using FrameFlow one last time, as I felt a redemption arc was warranted. If the AI couldn't interpolate frames for one of the most common video codecs, then it couldn't do anything. As it turns out, it couldn't do anything. I killed FrameFlow and moved on. I didn't have time to waste. I needed to do the drunk screen, and I needed to do the drunk screen fast. I only had around 5 hours until the stream started, so I opened up Blender and began reusing assets from earlier. Once I had a basic scene set up, I began modeling bottles of other alcoholic drinks and began placing them around the table. One of the interesting things about this setup is that I took advantage of the Blender camera's field of view and set it so that I could cover a large space in just a small amount of the frame. That allowed me to place more bottles, and it later let me set a focus point so certain parts of the image could be out of focus, which I hoped would end up giving it a more drunk and more bleary kind of look. Finally, I added a small half-dome of a glass material in front of the camera to act as a quote-unquote lens, which could give it a nice blurry chromatic aberration effect in addition to the field of view effect that I was going for. The reason I did this in camera instead of doing this in compositing was so that we could get more accurate and more interesting looking colors. If this is a process that you do after you're done with the render, it will look inherently very different to the process that you do during the render, and this gives you more control. I took everything into After Effects one last time so I could add a vignette and some bokeh. Then I brought it into DaVinci Resolve to color grade my last two assets. However, when I set them into OBS, I realized something was missing. It's my birthday. My 21st birthday. And it wouldn't feel like a special day for a special boy if I didn't make a special treat. So I went to the supermarket to buy a squash. Then I cut it open and scraped all of the seeds out. I put the squash in the oven at around 190 degrees centigrade and waited for about 90 minutes. When it was done, I took all of the insides and placed it in a blender. I pureed the squashes inwards, but ran into a little trouble because I overfilled the blender's bottle some. I diluted it with some water here and there, and eventually I got a nice runny liquid, which I placed in a Tupperware. Then I mixed 3/4 cups of brown sugar with 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of mace, clove, allspice, and nutmeg, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt.
Oh my god, this is impossible.
I cracked 2 eggs into a pot and then poured 1.5 cups of evaporated milk into it, as well as 2 cups of the squash puree. I mixed it thoroughly and then mixed in the dry ingredients as well. Next, I placed some puff pastry into a baking tray. I poured the mixture into the baking tray and put it in the oven at 190 degrees centigrade for around 50 minutes. When I took it out, I had a nice butternut squash pie. Still, it wasn't enough to have a special treat for a special boy. I needed to get myself in the right mindset. After having to do and redo things constantly for this overlay and cutting it so close to the deadline, I needed something to help me relax. So, when I started streaming, I could be as cool as a cucumber. I decided to watch my favorite movie, Lady Bird. Unfortunately, Netflix didn't have it anymore, so I settled for my second favorite movie, BlacKkKlansman. Then I recorded an episode of my Warrior Cats podcast, Four Trees, and I was finally ready to start my stream. I sat down with my fiddle and my loop pedal, and I started playing. Then, around 3 minutes later, I got a knock on my door from my neighbors asking me to stop. I was entirely unsure about how to proceed. My stream was just starting, and my phone was blowing up with messages from friends and family telling me that they were excitedly watching. So I decided the show must go on. I spent the next hour just hanging out and chatting, trying to eat pie with my chopsticks,
Spencer, are you eating pumpkin pie with chopsticks again?
and indulging the dolphin conspiracy theorists that were commenting on the stream. And despite it all, I had a good time. At the very least, I got to use my fancy Zoom backgrounds for my family video call a little while later, which was the whole conceit of this thing to begin with. Before I close, some final thoughts. Obviously, there are a lot of things I would have changed about this project had I had the power of hindsight. I find it incredible that something managed to go wrong at just about literally every step, and I won't pretend I'm not disappointed about some of it, but I also won't pretend that I don't find it all pretty funny. I think it reflects well on me that I kept pushing forwards, kept working around my obstacles, and ended up overcoming them all in one way or another. Even without music, my viewer retention was really solid, and my friends and family seemed to have a nice time. Now, technically speaking, I think that this is one of the more aesthetically strong overlays. I think it suffered slightly from a lack of a visually arresting component of it, like a fire off in the corner or something that moves a little bit more, but the look was cohesive and the color palette was pretty consistent, which I think is important. It's a shame I couldn't get the AFK screen to look just the way I wanted it, but I also think it was a worthy sacrifice in the name of moving forwards, and if I had spent any more time on it, I wouldn't have been able to get everything else done. So yeah, that was my garbage fire of a 21st birthday party. I hope you enjoyed! One more thing, I'd like to thank my friend Ivan Cray for editing this video for me as a birthday present. I greatly appreciate the reprieve. These videos are extremely time-consuming to make, and I'm looking forwards to finishing this series up. If you enjoyed the editing for this episode, please check out Ivan's work at ivancray.co.uk and consider hiring him for your projects.